And welcome into a Monday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. Well, we are going to be keeping an eye this week on a busy week for the North Carolina General Assembly as the House will be in session a little bit later on. They'll be back on Wednesday. And of course, they're going to be dealing with a big veto override. Senate Bill 382. This is a piece of legislation that includes an additional $227 million in disaster relief for portions of western North Carolina. With that, it also makes some major changes to the governor's authority and power amongst other individuals in the Council of State. We'll be tracking that all throughout the week right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. With the 2024 general election about a month or so behind us, things are already ratcheting up for the midterm elections all the way in 2026. And there's going to be a very contentious race here in North Carolina. U.S. Senator Thom Tillis is up for re-election. To get some details on a new poll by a group called Victory Insights, Donna King, the editor-in-chief over at CarolinaJournal.com, joins us this morning on the News Hour. Donna, this is a very interesting poll. It seems like we're just finally recovering from the general election this year, yet we're already got our eyes set on the midterms in 2026. And Thom Tillis is going to be a major part of that conversation, not just here in North Carolina, but likely across the country.
Oh, huge part of that conversation. You know, this really started even before November 6th. Thom Tillis's race was, I think, historically expensive the last go-round. And then I would anticipate we're going to keep hitting new records on the cost of Senate races every 2 years or every 6 years now from now on. So this new Victory Insights poll is looking at who North Carolina's senator could be starting in the 2026 race. In this, it shows Laura Trump would get 65% support in a primary against Tillis, who would get 11%. Now, in that, 24% of respondents in their poll said they are still undecided, but it really shows that a potential candidacy of Laura Trump, who is married to Eric Trump, Donald Trump's daughter-in-law, could actually bring a lot of attention to this race, even without Tillis.
Laura, also grew up in North Carolina. She grew up in Wrightsville Beach, just outside of the Wilmington area. She's currently co-chair of the RNC with former NC GOP chair Michael Whatley. A lot of North Carolina connections in regards to this. Is some of this, Donna, predicated, however, on how Tillis handles himself over the next 2 years with the Trump administration and how conservative he is in regards to Trump's agenda?
Absolutely. I think that's going to be huge because there is a big chunk of North Carolina's Republican base that believes that Tillis is not conservative enough on some key issues, that he's not been pro-Trump enough in their view. So he's got something to really prove, I think, to that base of Republican voters, that he is on, Team Trump, or that he is willing to work with the White House and do it in an effective way. Tillis has always been, worked in the leadership offices there when Tillis was Speaker of the House, and he does work across the aisle effectively, but he also led his caucus really effectively. He ushered in that new Republican era of state policy. So, he is a formidable opponent, but right now Republicans, that base, is not happy with him. So, Laura Trump coming in and potentially primarying him with those kind of poll results 2 years out, that could really be interesting. But this poll also looked at how she might do against a potential Cooper nominee on the Democrat side. And in that, Cooper has about a 1.5% edge over Laura Trump in that race. So could she easily win the primary, but she may not be able to win the general if Cooper is her opponent.
Well, and I think that's an important distinction to note. I mean, we saw that with the governor's race back a couple of weeks ago. You had Mark Robinson, who came firing out of both barrels out of the primary, huge support amongst Republican voters. Yet, Donna, he loses the general election by 15%, 800,000 votes. It's the worst spread for a governor's loss in 44 years across the state of North Carolina. There's a huge difference between the both Republican and Democrat primary and, of course, the general election.
It really is. Now, I will also say that his campaign was weighted down by things that would not be really impacting Laura Trump. So, that was a spectacular fashion loss in that way. But it's important to note that Roy Cooper is popular in North Carolina. He has always polled highly, even when Republicans are very angry about some of his policy, even when he takes a far left or progressive stance on things, fights with the Republican-led legislature, vetoes budget after budget after budget that has teacher raises in it, still remains pretty much above water in popularity and favorability. So would that translate then into a Senate race? It could. But it is important that, Laura Trump would be very popular here, I think, particularly when we're looking at that key demographic, that, suburban woman who is looking, for just a change of, fresh blood, new voice on Capitol Hill. And she would probably appeal to that voter. And it's a critical demographic.
No question about it being a critical demographic. When do you expect that this race would actually start taking place as we get ready to turn the calendar over to 2025? Obviously, the national news on Trump is going to suck a lot of air out of really anything that goes on in any other state. That's going to be the main focus and what people are going to be focusing on. When do you think we'd start seeing a race like this start, little eggshells here and there that people start dropping on us? When do you think that would really begin?
Well, I mean, she's not a North Carolina resident right now. She's a resident of Florida, so that would have to change first. So I believe she would, of course, to run in the primary, she has to be affiliated with the party in the state. She has to be there for 90 days. You can't register with that party until you're a resident. So there's a few gates that she'd have to hit. Since she'd have to file for a candidacy in, say, December, she would really have to start living in North Carolina and move back here by September of 2025. So we're talking about not even a year right now. If we see her, buying a beach house, down in Wrightsville or Wilmington, and really making a residency here starting in September of 2025, I think it's off to the races.
And now on the Democrat side, obviously, Governor Roy Cooper is the name that's been tossed around. Irregardless of what listeners this morning think about Roy Cooper, Donna, he is an incredibly popular candidate. If he wasn't term limited out, he would likely continue to be the governor probably as long as he wanted to be. And is it one of these situations where he's probably the main contender for the Democrat aisle, or are there other individuals that'll try and make a serious play in the primary against him?
Sure. I mean, I would anticipate that there will be several potential candidates. There was some talk that had Kamala Harris won, he would be, number one in the queue for potentially AG, Attorney General, that kind of thing. So I'm not really sure. He seems to be somebody who likes the executive role, and so an agency head, or it would have been probably the cleanest fit for him. In this case, the Senate. I think that he is just really has been a leader of the Democratic Party in North Carolina from a fundraising standpoint, so he seems like the natural choice.
You can read more on this story by visiting our website, carolinajournal.com. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour on a Monday morning. We were talking earlier about how the North Carolina House is back in Raleigh. They'll be back on Wednesday dealing with an override of Senate Bill 382. However, there's some other legislation that the House will be taking up. In this case, it's a constitutional amendment that we talked about last week. In the close of the Senate session, which took place 1 week ago on Monday, North Carolina lawmakers are now pushing for a permanent 5% income tax cap to be put onto the state constitution. Now, unlike regular laws, regular legislation that has to go through both chambers and then make its way over to the governor for his signature, the General Assembly has discretion to, pass constitutional amendments. Now, obviously, they don't become part of the Constitution right away. They have to make their way to a ballot, and voters have to decide. This proposal will cap the state income tax at 5%. The current North Carolina Constitution caps it at 7%, and Republican lawmakers say that they are doing this to protect the state of North Carolina. If power were to change, obviously I think they're referring there to Democrats taking control of the General Assembly, they would be unable to raise the personal income tax over 5% if this constitutional amendment were to pass. We'll see what the House does with that on Wednesday and when that will be coming to a ballot in elections to come. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. We've got some new decisions from the North Carolina Court of Appeals this morning that are, of course, centrally located in individual cases and lawsuits, but could have some bigger statewide effects. To get additional details on that this morning, it's my pleasure to welcome Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation to our airwaves here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Mitch, a food truck in Jacksonville. That is one of the cases that we are discussing this morning. Why should folks across the state care about some food truck operator in Jacksonville, North Carolina? What's the relevance of that?
Well, the biggest issue is this is another sign of our state court systems paying a lot more attention to rules from government that limit your ability to earn a living. The lawsuit started with a business property owner in Jacksonville and two food truck operators who sued the city of Jacksonville over its regulations dealing with food truck. Now, there was several different pieces that came out of this lawsuit. One was the fees were being challenged as overly onerous. There was also a challenge to the sign restrictions for food trucks. And the major piece of this was the fact that the rules were written in such a way that basically 96% of the city of Jacksonville was off limits for food trucks because of the distance that you had to keep between food trucks and a brick and mortar restaurant. And the lawsuit that's being led by the Institute for Justice basically said that most of these regulations were designed just to protect brick and mortar restaurants against the competition. Now, when this case went to a trial judge, the trial judge threw the whole thing out, ruled in favor of Jacksonville. So IJ and the three plaintiffs, the two food truck operators and the other business owner who wanted to host food trucks on her property, they went to the Court of Appeals, argued before a three-judge Court of Appeals panel, and the ruling that came out this week, written by Jefferson Griffin, who we've talked about as a candidate for state Supreme Court, said, hey, this lawsuit should go forward. The trial judge was wrong to throw it out. And basically, the appeals court says every piece of this lawsuit should go forward. The challenge to the sign restrictions, the challenge to the what are being called overly burdensome fees, and the challenge to the restrictions that block food trucks from operating in all but about 4% of the city of Jacksonville. And basically, the argument is that at this stage in the lawsuit, and it's still early in the lawsuit, and it's not a final win for the food truck operators. It's basically just a chance for them to go back to the starting line and get moving again. They are saying that their free speech rights are being violated, their rights to equal protection of the laws are being violated, and their rights to enjoy the fruits of their own labor, which is a basic guarantee that we have in our North Carolina Constitution. The appeals court says, yes, they've made a credible case at this point to be able to go forward with this lawsuit. And that's a positive sign for anyone who wants to see state government and local governments get some strict scrutiny, or at least some stronger than rational basis scrutiny from the courts about these types of economic liberty restrictions. So while this case really just deals with food trucks in Jacksonville, and if you're not in Jacksonville, the basic details of the case probably don't interest you that much. The idea of protecting economic liberty and making sure that local governments don't adopt rules that block people from earning a living, that should be of interest to all North Carolinians.
Well, and we saw a case back a couple of years ago that was surrounded with Airbnb and short-term rentals, where you had local municipalities, similar to this food truck story, charging ridiculous fees for individual property owners, private property owners, to register their Airbnb with the city, the county, the municipality. Same thing with restrictions. You can only have certain rentals on certain streets within a proximity of everything else, Mitch. This is a big deal for, in the case of food trucks, essentially a kind of a new business that's spawned up. It seems like if you drove from the Tennessee border to the Atlantic Ocean in North Carolina, you're going to find some food truck gathering, a food truck rodeo, something going on almost every single weekend. These things are very popular. And in the case of the Jacksonville story, it sounds like some traditional brick and mortar business owners lobbied their local government to essentially outlaw it.
And that was actually part of the argument that was made in court. It's that the initial suggestions of how these rules were going to play out would have allowed much more of Jacksonville to be open to food trucks. But then after the initial rules were drafted, some owners of brick and mortar restaurants complained to the city council. The city council, in debating this issue, actually kind of talked about the issue of protecting the brick and mortar restaurants from the competition. And so the lawsuit alleges that the rules that came out were actually designed on their face to protect brick and mortar restaurants from competition, and that was not a legitimate government purpose for restricting the food trucks. As I said earlier, this basically allows the lawsuit to go back to the starting line. They're still going to have to prove all of these allegations, but they don't just get the case thrown out because the city said, hey, we're allowed to do this. And the judge said, oh, yeah, okay, you are. I'm going to throw out the lawsuit. The city will really have to justify that the rules that it put in place had a legitimate government interest and were not just designed to block competition for traditional restaurants.
Does this go back to the same judge that originally, as you noted, essentially tossed this whole thing out, or does somebody else get another stab at this?
It really depends on how the process plays out in the local court system. You would think that it would go back to the initial judge, but it may end up going to another judge in that court. Probably just depends on the timing. We know that depending on the size of a court district and the number of judges in a court, a different judge might get the same case, depending on the timing and the availability of the judge.
We'll keep an eye on it. You can read more details by visiting our website, carolinajournal.com. And welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Continuing our discussion this morning with Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation about some recent cases from the North Carolina Court of Appeals, we'll turn our conversation to Moore County, the city or the town of Pinehurst. Mitch, there was some legal action brought against them dealing with open meeting laws, which we know are a serious thing here in the state. You have to, if you're going to be conducting any sort of business as a local government, a state government, you've got to follow some rules and regulations surrounding that. Can you give us an overview of that case and what the appeals court had to say on that?
Sure. And the quirky piece of this, Nick, is the idea of conducting meetings of a public body via email. And whether that is something that's going to violate the open meetings law. So going back to the start of this controversy, it was in September of 2021. There's a 5-member board for the village of Pinehurst, and there was a meeting that took place in closed session at which 3 of the board members were concerned about the actions of 2 of the other board members, saying that they were probably violating the village's ethics policy by the way that they were interacting with business owners and legislators and others. And so there was some concern in a closed meeting. Then several weeks later, in October of 2021, there was another public meeting. And at that time, the mayor, who led the 3 members who had concerns about the other 2 members, read some statements of concern, talked about the actions that they didn't like from these other 2 board members. And later on, at another meeting, a couple weeks later, there was a prepared statement that was read at the meeting about the actions of those 2 members. Well, one of the people who was involved, who was on the receiving end of this criticism, lost his election. Several months later, formed a group called NC Citizens for Transparent Government. And a few months after that, in 2022, filed suit against the village of Pinehurst. And the argument was that between that first meeting in September of 2021 and the second one in October, that the three members who were concerned were conducting public business via email, that the things that cropped up in that October 2021 meeting were things that were all discussed and decided via email rather than in a public session of the Village of Pinehurst Council. And the argument was that this was violating the state open meetings law, and the suit was calling for the courts to declare it was a violation of the open meetings law. Well, as the case initially went forward, got thrown out, but then it got to the Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals basically in this ruling this week said, no, this is not a violation of the open meetings law. This is, especially if you look at what happened, to have an open meetings law, there has to be simultaneous activity. So perhaps if they were having emails in which every couple of seconds or every couple of minutes someone was responding and they were taking a vote, and you could tell by the email trail that they were acting as if it was a meeting, perhaps that would be some sort of violation. But this was a regular email chain where someone writes an email, several hours later, someone writes something, someone may chime in a day or two later. In some cases, it's one council member interacting with the village manager and village attorney. So it's not even a meeting because there's only one person involved. None of this chain of emails would constitute anything approaching a meeting. So basically the case was thrown out. It said, no, none of this is a public meeting, and so none of it can be treated as a violation of the open meetings law. Now, one of the interesting aspects about this is this wasn't just a challenge by a disgruntled former member of the Pinehurst Village Council. This involved a media coalition that got involved and filed paperwork back in the spring supporting the plaintiff, saying, hey, we should treat these as open meetings when a majority of the members of a council decide that they're going to conduct business and not have it be in the public, that this should be considered an open meeting, and if considered a public meeting, and if they don't share that information in a timely way, then they're violating the open meetings law. So it'll be interesting to see if this is the end of the story, if business that seems to be conducted via email is just decided no longer to be thought of as potentially a public meeting, or if there will be other cases or even an appeal of this case in which some other conclusion is reached, because it seems fairly clear from the circumstances of this case that there was not an open meeting, because the email chain was taking place over the course of weeks, where one email may follow another hours later or sometimes even days later. But I could see a scenario in which a majority of a board decides that they're actually going to meet via email and conduct business, in which you see emails flowing every couple of minutes or every few minutes, and that would be a way to skirt the open meetings law. So it'll be interesting to see if this is the end of the story, or if this case gets appealed to the state Supreme Court, and if the state Supreme Court takes it, or if this case dies, but some other board says, hey, that's a good idea, let's conduct meetings via email, and then you see future litigation arising from that.
Now, typically, again, we're talking about a relatively small municipality here, Pinehurst, the village of Pinehurst in Moore County. Mitch, I know in most areas across the state, you're able to do a relatively simple public records request with local government emails. That's the case across a vast majority of the state of North Carolina. Is that come into this at all, or does that have any impact on whether this is or is not an open meeting? I mean, obviously, somebody was able to get access to these emails, irregardless of whether it was considered an open meeting or not.
Yeah, well, the emails definitely came out in this case because there was a lawsuit filed. So the Village of Pinehurst had to turn over the emails. I think the issue, and one of the reasons that the Media Coalition got involved, and we're not just talking about the local Pinehurst paper, we're talking about major media outlets across the state of North Carolina that saw this case and saw it was of interest, is uh, to know that a meeting is taking place via email, you have to have some sort of suspicion that something that's done in the public meeting came out of some email exchanges. A lot of what's done in open meetings, you basically just say, okay, these people are talking about the issues that concern them, and they have thought about it themselves. But maybe they coordinated ahead of time, and the only way that you could get an inkling that they were conducting business via email rather than in the open meetings that they're supposed to do is if something came up that made you say, wait a minute, this can't have been something that just cropped up right now. There had to have been some sort of coordination ahead of time. And how did they do it? Maybe they did it via email. And so you would really have to rely on some watchdog or some intrepid reporter who's watching a public meeting and saying, wait a minute, this just doesn't pass the smell test. This is not something that just emerged from the natural discussion. Something about this is coordinated, and maybe they used email to do it. Otherwise, unless you regularly say, I want to have all the emails between these people, X and Y, or among these people, X, Y, and Z, unless you did that on a regular basis, you wouldn't know.
Very true. Mitch, great update this morning. Appreciate it. Mitch Kokai joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour as we continue to track recovery out of Western North Carolina from the devastation left by Hurricane Helene. The Biltmore Estates in Asheville is welcoming visitors for another year of its Christmas at Biltmore program. Surprisingly, it started in early November and runs through portions of early January. The event showcases the historic mansion, decked in elaborate holiday decorations, and offers a range of seasonal activities for folks that visit. The estate features over 100 Christmas trees, 1.5 miles of fresh garland, 500 wreaths, and over 200 poinsettias, amongst other holiday decor. Flooding and other site damage kept the historic estate closed for just 36 days. However, they reopened just in time on November the 2nd for the holiday season. Tickets are available for a variety of activities and tours, which include access to 800 acres of grounds at the Biltmore Estate. It is remarkable with some of the pictures that we saw out of the Buncombe County, Asheville area that the Biltmore Estate was able to get open and operational for the holiday season. However, the tradition continues alive and well out in Western North Carolina. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. The holiday shopping season is upon us, not only across the United States, but here in North Carolina. To get some more details on that this morning, I'd like to welcome Andy Ellen, the president and general counsel for the North Carolina Retail Merchants Association, to the Carolina Journal News Hour this morning to talk about what that holiday season and how that's shaking up here across the state. Andy, thanks for the time. You've got a first annual report out this morning. Can you tell us a little details about that?
Yes. So we contracted with the Appalachian State University Center for Economic Research and Policy Analysis to do a deep dive in North Carolina, both on the importance of the retail industry, but especially as we head into the holiday season, what we're looking at economically for this holiday season, and hopefully a very, very successful one.
Well, the last couple of years have been really rough on people's paychecks, wallets, pocketbooks, however you'd like to describe it, with inflation. But with that, it looks like we're starting to see a little bit of a recovery, a little bit of a comeback. You're expecting holiday shopping to actually be up this year. What do those figures look like?
We were looking for holiday shopping to be up in North Carolina. Last year it was about $42.08 billion. We're expecting about $42.24 billion this year. which is a great increase. Again, some of that, there are some inflationary factors in some of those figures, but overall very positive. And that's even with a very shortened holiday season. We only have 4 weeks between Thanksgiving and Christmas. So this year it's a little shortened. It's going to be a little more, intense. So we're going to have to make up our sales in a very timely manner.
Let's talk a little bit. You mentioned inflation there, and as you go through the full report, which will be available at carolinajournal.com, you do have to, of course, calculate inflation into that. How does that whole process work as you work with the folks over at App State and got this study together?
They have some formulas that they put together with looking at inflation and sort of a baseline of what it would be without inflation and what it ends up being with inflation, and and that's something that we're seeing across the board. But it also, has other factors, not just the price of the good, but also the price of labor, the price of transportation, the price of energy. Those things that all get factored into why something on the shelf may be more expensive this year than it was last year, or this month rather than last month.
Andy, the elephant in the room, of course, is the devastation and continued cleanup and recovery out in western North Carolina. Were you able to factor that into your report, and what is some of that looking like?
They did take that into account and try to do it. And again, for the first time we've done this, having to put that big a factor into it is unusual, and we hope very unusual. I hope we don't have one of those again. There is just so much unknown in the western part of the state. There are parts of the state out there that are recovering and coming back faster than others. There are other parts of it around the Blue Ridge Parkway, or you think about a Chimney Rock or a Lake Lure area, that are just completely devastated. But you are seeing some increased activity. I saw, the Biltmore Estate is back open, the Grove Park is back open, but those shops from Biltmore Village right beside of the Biltmore Inn, were completely destroyed. So that's going to play a big factor into not only the sales, but the employees who would be getting a paycheck, who would be turning around and spending that in the economy. The question is, if you were a tourism employee, did you stay or did you go south to Hilton Head or Charleston or somewhere else to get a job so you could support your family, and you're no longer here generating that money in the economy? So a lot of unknown there. We're hoping, that consumers will go out and support those businesses in the western part of the state where they're able to take tourists or they're able to take visitors, and support those businesses. They really need it.
Yeah, and I think for tourism, most people, of course, assume the eastern half of the state, the coast, is super busy during the summertime. But as we've unfortunately learned, a lot of folks unfortunately learning this over the last couple of weeks and months, that the western half of the state, it's all based around tree peeping and checking out the snow and enjoying some of those activities out there. So that's, of course, we're continuing to follow that recovery. As you mentioned, Andy, a little while ago, this is your first annual report. Tell us why you decided to conduct this study, and presumably this will be something that we'll see for years to come from the Retail Association.
Yes, sir. So my counterpart in Ohio has been doing this for a number of years, but oftentimes we get calls from media or other entities looking for what is the economic forecast for North Carolina, not only on the holiday season, but also on things like back to school. And the retail sector supplies 1 out of every 4 jobs in North Carolina, so probably the largest private employer. We felt it was imperative for us to have the data so we could look at it and then baseline it going forward through the years to see how retail is doing in North Carolina, especially around the holiday season. So that was sort of the impetus for us doing this, and we're, again, very excited about the first one and looking forward to many, many more of these.
Outside of this report, tell us a little bit of the day-to-day activities and what you guys are involved in throughout the year.
So we were founded in 1902, so coming up on our 125th anniversary. Our job is to make North Carolina the best place to operate a retail business. Our primary focus has always been advocacy, both at the state level and a lesser extent at the congressional and local level. But we work on things like sales tax and alcohol laws. Big focus of late has been organized retail crime and shopping, in this case during the holiday season, making sure people are shopping safe, buying things from legitimate sources. And then another big factor has been a program we have called Shop and See, which is post-COVID. We want to focus on getting consumers back into their physical store, pushing away from the laptop, and going in and remembering why they enjoyed shopping locally so much. Those retailers are there every single day supporting their community, whether it's sponsoring the Little League team or the high school football team or the theater program. If you look just recently, our members are the largest donators to the food banks every year. Our organization does a $50,000 a year scholarship, or excuse me, $50,000 a year donation to the North Carolina food banks. And we actually just did another $50,000 one to the western part of the state just this last week. So we're supporting the communities our members are. We hope others will come out and do that. That's what our organization is based around.
Great report. Thanks for the time. Andy Allen joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour.